Non-traditional theories of skill acquisition. Last week we talked specifically about the physical constraints, and we talked specifically about Bernstein's degrees of freedom problem and how self-organization can help us understand skill acquisition better. This week we are going to talk about informational constraints and how sensory perception, information flows, the visual array, etc. can influence how we acquire skills. We call this the ecological approach to skill acquisition. So you'll see after this week, you'll have all the baggage that you need to put together the constraints-led approach to skill acquisition, which we'll start focusing on in a practical and theoretical manner from next week. So what are we going to do? We're going to discuss how humans use information in order to be skillful within their environments. We're going to focus specifically on the influence of visual constraints, visual informational constraints. We're briefly touching on how haptic or acoustic constraints can influence the acquisition of a skill. And then finally, we're going to discuss how that affects skill acquisition in general. So we've been, as I told you, in this non-traditional theory, we've been involved with two main overarching issues. There's, on one side, all of the physical constraints that affect skillfulness, and on the other side, there's the informational constraints. And when we talk about informational constraints, we are talking about the way we perceive through sensory information, regardless of what that sensory information is, some of the underlying constructs of the world in which we move. So things like environmental events, objects, the types of surfaces that we play or move on, the sensory information and the quality of sensory information that we receive, etc. So informational constraints are constraints nonetheless, but they always focus on energy flow, right? They talk about things that we can perceive with our senses. And a lot of that information that we have on how informational constraints affect action come from the discipline, yes, it's an entire discipline, unfortunately, of studying interceptive actions. Yeah, so people were interested in how an individual, right, in such a complicated, dynamic environment can intercept a moving object. And you might not think that's an amazing feature of our body, but it truly is. Imagine this person intercepting this ball in that sort of circumstance. It is an incredibly complicated feature that our human body has inbuilt. Right? So we are very good at intercepting objects in very information-rich environments. And it's those people who started studying these interceptive actions who came up with a lot of the translation of this ecological approach to motor skill acquisition. Because when you think about it, regardless of which motor skill you execute, for example, there might be a surgeon who needs to make a really minor incision. That surgeon has to take into account a whole lot of factors, right? They have to take into account what is the condition of the patient. How quickly do I have to make this incision? How much pressure do I have to apply? How rough is the tissue that I have to cut in, etc. Right? What are potential consequences when I make an error? And using motor skills in these really rich environments is incredibly difficult. And in this case, it's a matter of life and death. Now, what I'm going to tell you in this lecture is that despite what we've been told by previous theories, the computational information processing theories, there is no mental calculation going on in this particular motor skill. And when a surgeon does this incision, yes, they are thinking, but they are not necessarily calculating, if the density of a vein is X, then I have to apply pressure Y because of this mathematical formula. Right? So we are able to interact with a super information-rich environment without necessarily having any really tough, really complicated mental processing of these activities. And so that's what we're, in short, that's what we're talking about today. So when we coordinate our body with our environment, we satisfy 3 different task constraints. And these seem simple at first, but once you start to apply these theories in the sports hall, when you're doing your peer instruction session, for example, you'll start thinking about these things in an entirely different manner. So first of all, we've got to satisfy the when component. Regardless of how we interact with our environment, whether we're trying to contact objects, avoid objects, etc., we need to satisfy a when component. Yeah? In other words, when you're trying to cross the street, we have to make sure we cross the street at exactly the right time when there's a gap in between cars. We're satisfying a when component. We're also satisfying a how component. Yeah, we need to run or walk at a particular speed in order to make it just through that gap in between cars. Interacting with our environment requires a when and a how component. And then finally, it requires a where component. Where should we make contact with an object, or where should we avoid contact with an object? In other words, are we crossing the street in a diagonal to get to a curb that's a little bit lower because it's easier to get onto, or are we crossing the street in a horizontal to move onto an object that's maybe a little bit higher? And so just satisfying these 3 task components is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly complicated. And it takes us years and years and years to master meeting that when, how, and where component. Because imagine a child, right? No one leaves a child alone by the side of the street because a child's not very good at using the when component. It's also not very good at knowing how fast it needs to run to cross between cars. And it's definitely not good at knowing where it needs to intersect these cars in order to be safe. Right? So it takes us a really, really long time as human beings to develop some sort of independence in satisfying these components. And what's really important is that in order to satisfy these 3 task constraints, we have to get really high quality information. Yeah? And remember, I said high quality information doesn't just come from your eyes, it also comes from how you perceive that information. That's so how you put together or stitch together the images seen by 2 eyes. And so we already know there's different components we need to satisfy, and we need high quality visual or sensory information in order to satisfy these components. And of course, we've been told many, many times by traditional models that perceptual motor control is not as difficult as I just made it look. It's actually a lot simpler, is what the traditional theory said. They said, if you have an intention to act, all you're doing is you're processing some sort of sensory information that you've been given around the task, and you use that to execute a motor action, then generate feedback from that motor action, which then allows you to readapt your movement. Right? And we've said that's a very approachable model, that traditional model, because it's very, very easy to understand. Right? However, when we interact with a really dynamic, ever-changing environment, it is impossible that this sort of model can work. It just doesn't work. It is way too slow. Then we need a much more fast-acting model, and where we can save time is in how much cognitive processing is required in order to execute a motor action. And that's really what we're going to talk about. And one way to reduce the amount of cognitive processing that is required is to just cut it out of the model. And what ecological psychologists say is that rather than requiring some really complicated cognitive processing when we're moving in our environment, perception is directly coupled with action. That generates new perception, new action, new perception, new action, and we don't necessarily need cognitive processing in the middle of that in order to understand our environment. And that makes sense, right? Because how many times have you been in a situation where you've had to act really, really quickly, whether that was in sport or when you were driving your car, and when someone would have asked you, how did you make that decision? Or at what particular time did you choose to press the pedal, the brake pedal in your car? You would have said, well, I have no idea. I just acted, right? And that's really what ecological psychologists say. In information-rich environments, We use information, translate it immediately into action, and then get new information from that is immediately translated in action with limited amounts of cognitive processing that are required. That relationship between perception and action is circular. So information, in that case, information really has the ability to constrain action. So when we talk about informational constraints, we're talking about that perception-action coupling, and how perception has the ability to change the way we act in a very direct manner. All right, that was reasonably conceptual, but I know you've all been in this situation. Right? You're standing at the traffic lights, just like here, and you're trying to cross to the other side. At the other side, there's another bunch of people who are standing there. I'm standing here, there's plenty of other people behind me. When I start crossing, right? When I start crossing, how am I navigating that sort of dynamic, ever-changing environment? Have you ever thought about it? What am I actually doing? When I start crossing now, right, there's people from the other side. What would I do? I'm trying to avoid them, right? So I'm walking, one of these people, I'm walking, I'm ducking in a gap, trying to avoid them. What is everyone behind me doing? They are all ducking in my gap, right? I'm the leader, it makes me feel so good when I do it, right? So I duck in a gap, everyone ducks in a gap behind me. They don't do it consciously, they are automatically moving into that environment. Why? Self-organization, and self-organization works when that solution is the most efficient. The most efficient way to get to this crowd is to have someone else go first, right? Duck in the gap behind them. And ecological psychologists say that is really how we interact with our environment. We don't think about how we navigate that crowd, we just act. We act based on a perception from others. And to give you an example, what happens when all the people who are coming towards me are all using their phone? Am I more likely to run into someone?
Yes.
Why am I more likely to run into someone?
Because they're not ducking the gaps.
They are not doing the same, right? So the perceptual information I'm reading from others is not normal to me. It's not something I'm used to seeing. I think that they'll duck in a gap next to me, but they just keep running straight and I just walk onto them. And everyone's felt that, right? People who are watching on their phone, you just run into them and you run into another one, right? Because they are not acting in a predictable manner. We are attuned to the information that the environment provides us, and we are so used to coupling it directly with action that when someone does something unexpected, that all of a sudden becomes really, really difficult for us to act in that sort of environment. And that's one of the strongest ways in which we can understand how perception and action are directly coupled. So, to understand how information constrains action, we have to understand what an open system is. And when I talk about an open system, I talk about an environmental context in which energy is allowed to flow in a very natural manner, right? For example, the example we have here. Energy that is flowing in this particular context is the perceptual information I'm receiving from others. It is the grippiness of the surface that I'm walking on, etc. And all of that energy flow is captured in an open system. And we call it an open system because the energy flow in that system constantly changes. When people move, the energy flow changes. When it rains, the surface becomes more slippery. It's an open system. And most biological systems are used to operating within these open systems. Now, that's not just the environmental energy, but we also have energy, right? We store energy, for example, in our muscles, right? So we've got this conflict here. There's environmental energy and there's my own energy. If I was an antelope, right? I know it's easy to imagine. If I was an antelope, what would I rather use? Environmental energy or my own energy? Environmental energy, right? Because if I'm running from a lion, it is much more beneficial for me to be energy efficient use the environment's energy than to use my own energy. Makes sense, right? And us as humans, we become really, really good at that as well. The longer we operate in a certain environment, the better we get at harvesting the open system's energy and not using our own. For example, a tightrope walker, tightrope walking is difficult. I don't know if anyone here is good at it, but it's very difficult to do. But it becomes easier once you are able to harvest the rope's energy or the open system's energy rather than using your own. And that seems like an abstract concept, but the way in which we understand it is when you're playing the drums, right, and feeling very tired, you're harvesting your own energy. When you're playing the drums and you're being very relaxed, you're harvesting the bounciness of the drum set, right? You're harvesting the energy that's already in the open system. A tightrope walker does the same. They harvest the frictional energy of the rope in order to traverse from one point to the next. They use as little of their own energy as they possibly can. And this is really how information in the environment constrains action. It allows us, if we harvest it right, it allows us to be very energy efficient. For example, regardless of whether or not you're athletic, has anyone ever tried to turn more than 360 degrees while jumping?
Yep.
Yeah? So it's actually not that easy to do, right? 360 degrees is still fine, land in the same spot, kind of difficult, but turning more than 360 degrees from the floor is very difficult, right? But these ice skaters, when you ask them, and I worked with many when I was a PhD student, they are very good at harvesting environmental energy, in this case, reducing, for example, the resistance that their body creates when they turn, and they are very, very good at rotating more than 360 degrees and landing in the same spot. Yeah? So the better you get, or the more attuned you get to environmental information, the better you get at harvesting it so you don't have to use your own. And that's not just in a physical sense, but also in an informational sense or a sensory sense. If we think about goalkeepers, right? We said in motor learning last year that an expert goalkeeper can discriminate him or herself from a non-expert by the type of perceptual information that they use. Right? Remember, what did we say that an expert goalkeeper looks at? The lower body or the upper body? The lower body. Right? And they look at the lower body because they become attuned to the information that's in the open system in front of them. They've learned over time that the most vital parts of information are captured in the lower body of the penalty taker. A non-expert goalkeeper, what do they do? Sorry? Yeah, they look at the upper body, and they also look all over the place. They go absolutely everywhere. Right? When we do perceptual experiments with non-experts, their gaze behavior is from one side to the other and absolutely everywhere. They are super energy inefficient. They do not know where to look because they haven't been accustomed to being in that open system for long enough, and they don't know where the most pertinent sources of environmental information are. And so that's something that we can find whether you look at extreme experts in the physical domain or cognitive domain. Usually what you find is the longer someone has been exposed to a particular environment, the better they get at harvesting its energy. Now, one of the researchers that we will talk about most often is J.J. Gibson. And J.J. Gibson is one of the forefathers of ecological psychology, and he really taught us about two things. One, the difference between variance and invariance in the information flow around us. And second, the concept of affordances or invitations for action. Now these two are going to be vitally important when you design learning environments for others later. You're going to have to understand these concepts because you will have to manipulate them in such a way that your learners can perceive affordances for action. In other words, they do exactly what you want. So, as I mentioned, regardless of where we are, when we are in an open system, we are completely surrounded by its energy. Whether that's the energy that emanates from light emitted by objects around us, or sound waves, or the frictional energy that's in the ground, etc. We are surrounded by energy. And the cool thing is, when we are surrounded by energy, we can manipulate that energy. Right? When we move around, the energy around us changes as well. Okay? Let me give you an example. If you are walking on this road, right? When you're standing here, none of the sloping surface or the specific nature of this road is revealed to you. It's only revealed to you as you start moving. Because as you move, the environment around you reveals its invariant features, the things that don't change. And it's those things, those invariant features, that we use as affordances for action. So it's that information that's pertinently important for us to organize our movements or our body within an open system to harvest its energy. Okay? Imagine it this way. Variance and invariance can be seen as, I'll use an analogy. You walk into a house, no one's been in there for a long time, and it's really dusty, right? You can't see anything underneath the dust. But when you walk, all the dust starts moving, right? And all of a sudden, you can reveal the features underneath the dust. There might be some books, or there might be a pen, etc. The way we move around in our environment is exactly the same. We move, and while we move, the environment reveals its invariant features. Okay? And in in ecological psychology, that's often referred to as perceive to move, move to perceive. Now, we need to use sensory information in order to interact with our environment, but as we interact with our environment, new sensory information is revealed. Yeah? And we call that, remember before, we called that perception-action coupling. So, as we move around in the environment, the essential structure within our optical array or our visual field is revealed. And it's only revealed when we move around. And that structure consists of invariants. And those invariants, Gibson said, those invariants are opportunities or invitation for action. So we said perceive to move, move to perceive. An example. Imagine this golfer, right? They're standing right there in their visual field. They can see the hole, and there's a little bit of structure that they might be able to see, but it is only when they move within their environment that the entire structure, the invariant structure within the environment, becomes available. Okay? The golfer who's standing there and who cannot see that there's a bunker there, they are likely to use a different type of shot than a golfer who is standing there and can actually see the hole as well as the bunker. They'd rather be short a little bit, than take a risk and overshoot or whatever it's called, or overplay. Yeah? So it's only when we move around in the environment that the invariance or the invariant information that we use for action, that is revealed. So by moving, a learner's visual system can pick up those sources of information that are pertinent in the environment. They don't change. And because they don't change, it allows us to become attuned to those sources of information. And the more we deal with them, the more we become attuned to them, the better we get at harvesting their energy. Right? So in other words, you can translate that as someone who's moved around in certain environments a lot, i.e., who's played a lot of football, for example, becomes attuned to the invariant information that's available in the environment in order to use that to become more energy efficient. Does that make sense? Yeah? And these ideas were initially theoretical, but a lot of research recently has been done looking at what are actually invariant features or affordances in the environment. And one of the most commonly reported invariants is actually the optical variable tau. This becomes a bit confusing, right? But let's just call it tau. Well, what tau is tau specifies time to contact. And for those of you who did motor learning, you can zone out for a minute. Yeah? So basically, when we perceive an object, what we actually perceive is its contours, right? The light that's emitted from the contours of the object. We perceive those contours, and that allows us to say how far away that object is based on how large it is or how quickly its size is changing on the retina of the eye. Now, that's a really cool feature because calculating how fast an object is approaching you is incredibly difficult, right? You might have done it with Libby in biomechanics or with Rob. Calculating how quickly an object is approaching you is difficult because it depends on the type of trajectory the ball is taking or the object is taking, or whether or not it's slowing down, accelerating, whether or not it has wind resistance, etc. But still, all of us, most of us, can catch a ball with one hand, right? And that shows you that perception-action coupling is actually how we interact with our environment. We don't need to make these mental calculations of how quickly an object is approaching to us. We see that visual angle as an invariant. Even though it changes, it is an invariant. It reveals an affordance for action. It invites us to intercept an object with timing in the right place. So time, where, and what did we say? Third one? How. Yeah, and the way in which we should track the object. Large aperture, grip aperture, small, etc. So that information alone as an invariant is enough for us to interact with a really complicated, ever-changing environment, and it doesn't require any cognitive processing from you. We are not mentally calculating how quickly the object is approaching. We are merely perceiving and acting, perceiving and acting. So, as I mentioned, no mental calculations are required to intercept an object. That means traditional information processing or computational approaches, they can be correct. Additionally, when you're interpreting an object coming towards you, it doesn't matter whether that object is red or yellow or blue, right? You are incredibly skillful at understanding that only tau is important for time to contact. The color of the ball is not important. The color of the ball is a variant, while tau is an invariant for action. Yeah? Tau invites action, while the color of the ball doesn't matter. And it is over time, after long times of intercepting objects, that we learn that time to contact information is the most important thing in trying to avoid or contact objects in the environment. And of course, that's extremely beneficial in dynamic or fast-paced environments, right, where there is actually no time to cognitively reflect. If you have to make a split-second decision while you're driving a really big truck as to trying to press the brake or moving out of the way of a parked car, something like that, you don't have time to cognitively process that information. And it is in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink. Has anyone read that? Yeah? So there's a section in there where he asks an ex-tennis player, he asks the ex-tennis player who's really good at calling when someone's about to make a double foul on the serve, and he asks him, how do you know they're about to commit a second error? And he says, no idea. I just see it and I call it. I don't think about it. Right? And that's really how experts interact with their environment. They don't necessarily cognitively reflect on everything. They just act. Right? And that seems like a very simplistic way of saying, thinking about how the brain works is too complicated. Let's not think about it and say perception and action are directly coupled. But it is really how we interact with our environment, especially in really fast-paced, dynamic environments. Yeah? For example, someone who's driving a rally car at extreme speeds, even though they do some cognitive processing, they don't necessarily have to process every little bit of information, relevant, irrelevant. They just act. They perceive and they act in a reciprocal manner. So, because Gibson defined what invariants and variants are within the environment, he said, well, when you see an invariant, when you move through your environment and you see an invariant, you can use that as an invitation or an affordance for action. And so when I say affordance, what I mean is invitation. And he said that neurobiological systems, like us, when they move in their environment, they actually see those invariants and they see them based on what they offer or invite for action. Yeah, and that's a very different way of looking at it than traditional theories did. And he said, well, if someone can see that environmental information as an affordance for action, I'm going to call that direct perception. Yeah? If you remember in week 1 and a little bit in week 2, we talked about the concept of indirect perception, where we said that someone has to process information before it becomes meaningful. Gibson said, well, indirect perception can't work in this environment. I'm going to call it direct perception. It doesn't need any real cognitive processing. We are just coupling an affordance for action with subsequent action. And I'll try and explain that to you using an experiment that one of my colleagues did a few years ago. And what he did was he used parkour athletes. Everyone knows parkour. Okay? So he used parkour athletes and he made them stand on different height boxes. And the boxes were between 0.5 meters and 2.5 meters high. And he asked them, land like what feels natural. And so they were asked to stand on one of those boxes, and they could make one of two landings. A precision landing, which is just a normal landing, or one of those roll landings. Yeah? And of course, all of you know that the higher the object is, and the more likely you are to use a roll landing. Yeah? All right. So what he saw in his study was, yes, there was some relationship between the height of a box and the type of landing that someone was using. And the first thing he concluded was that the height of a jump is perceived as an invariant, as an affordance for action. It either invites a precision landing or it invites a roll. But what's interesting here is that not every participant reacted in the same way. Some participants always used the precision landing, while others already started rolling at very low heights. And so these affordances, these invariants are also different for every single one here. Even though these were all experienced parkour athletes, they all had very different perception of those affordances for action. What do you think could have influenced whether someone chose a roll landing or a stick landing, even at a lower height? Let's say subject 5 there, who started rolling at 0.5 meters.
Biomechanical variations, like person's body stature, like height of legs, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Take someone like me. It already hurts when I jump off of this, and sort of my knees are almost going to break. Yeah. If I know that I've got a biomechanical advantage in terms of not feeling this much pain when I roll, I'm going to start rolling here. Right? So the interesting thing here is that the way or the affordance for action is different for each one of these individuals based on their own, what we call intrinsic dynamics, right? The baggage they take with them. If someone's really heavy, they might already start rolling here. If someone's really light, they might choose to keep doing the precision landing even at bigger heights. Yeah, and that's a really interesting finding because it shows that these parkour athletes use their environment in a very direct manner. They use direct perception to see how the height of a box can be the affordance for landing one of two ways.
Subject 5 is really interesting as well.
Sorry?
I was saying subject 5 is really interesting because we've got rolls and precisions at all times.
Yeah, that's right. So that means that this information that they perceive might have been affected by other factors as well. There might have been some fear, or there might have been just an experimentation. Maybe sometimes they were doing a stick landing, sometimes rolling, but it didn't really matter.
Or step before the drop.
That's right, something like that. But it shows us.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it shows us that the way in which people use information is very, very different. Yeah. let's take this particular example, right? Someone's playing squash. The ball is about to bounce here. This person can choose to either use a drive or a lob. Which kind of information do you think they use as an affordance for action? What is the invariant information in this environment?
Position of the other player.
Position of the other player, right? As this person moves, that invariant feature in the environment becomes clear. What else? What else do you think this player takes into account to choose whether they're going to drive or lob? Yeah, the distance the ball is from the wall, because one of them might need a slower movement of the racket, and you might potentially intersect the wall. What else? One more?
Optical variable tau.
Optical variable tau, the speed with which this ball is approaching, how far you still are away from the ball, and when you can generate that time to contact, or when you can contact this object. And I hope this shows you that an information-rich environment, and this is just two people, right? An information-rich environment like this doesn't allow you to think about every single action. It just doesn't exist. It is impossible. This person, if you would ask them straight after, why did you choose to use this or this shot? They might have some sort of idea, but a lot of this action would be implicit to them. And they won't be able to necessarily verbally describe every detail of it, which means it might not have been information that was necessarily cognitively processed all the time. And of course, we said, well, it's one thing understanding affordances for action, but how does that relate to skill acquisition? Well, in skill acquisition, we say the way in which someone uses information is the way in which they are attuned to whether or not certain invariants offer invitations for action. So a learner, through practice, through being in an environment in a specific context for a very long time, learns to automatically perceive those affordances for action. And the better you are at perceiving affordances for action, the faster you act. So with skill acquisition, we say a learner becomes attuned to the affordances that are captured within their environment. For example, Kevin De Bruyne, of course, doesn't cognitively process all of that information. He sees a player moving in the corner of his eye and gives the pass at exactly the right time, so that player is not in an offside position. He gives the pass at exactly the right, or with exactly the right amount of force, so that person can intersect it and create a goal-scoring opportunity. That is not a cognitive, or that is not a result of deliberate cognitive processing. It is a result of the Bruyne perceiving an affordance for action in the environment and acting in a direct manner. Yeah? I don't know how many of you know this, but there's different types of chess. Right? You've got chess without time constraints, and then you've got the chess with, I don't know, you've got a few minutes or a half an hour or something, and then you've got chess where you've only got a minute to play. Right? Has anyone seen any of that? Yeah? What is interesting there is that the world rankings in these three different types of chess, they are different. Right? It's not because you're a good slow chess player that you're a good fast chess player. A good fast chess player is incredibly, incredibly good at perceiving the affordances for action that are on the board. While a slow chess player doesn't have to be good at it at all. They can use cognitive processing all they want. They've got all the time in the world. Right? And that clearly shows how in one activity, affordances for action are really important in a dynamic, high-paced environment, while in another, it might not be as useful. And plenty of studies have been done looking at how people interact in a very direct manner with perceptual information. And I've been lucky to work with a Brazilian group who had a moving room, and we talked about the moving room experiment before. Basically, these people research how perception and action are coupled directly by moving a room that is imperceivable to a participant, and then looking at how much postural sway occurs as a result of that room movement. So even though none of the participants reported that they saw the room moving, they all showed increased backwards postural sway when the wall was coming this way, forwards postural sway when the wall was moving that way. And that shows us that perception and action work in a real direct manner, sometimes also called information-movement coupling, the same thing as perception-action coupling, information-movement coupling. And some researchers have tried to investigate how we actually do that, how we couple perception and action. And a lot of that information comes from the study of perceptual illusions. Yeah, and I'll show you an illusion in a second. But basically the premise here is that we've got two different streams in which we process or perceive information. We've got a dorsal stream. That's really important for the perception of action. If I want to do something with an object, this is the dorsal stream that I use. I use the ventral stream if I want to perceive an object, but not necessarily do something with them. And do something with it. And they are two very different things. So these researchers say, well, if they are two very different things, then we should be able to prove the existence of that dorsal and ventral stream with a optical illusion. So if you look at this illusion, this is the Ebbinghaus illusion. You also know the Muller-Lyer illusion, which is the illusion of two lines being of equal length. One of them has this, the other has that. Yeah? But basically what they did in experiments is they looked at whether people perceived A or B to be larger. And I think it's pretty clear to say that we all perceive, even though we know it's not the case, but we perceive A to be larger, right? Yeah? However, when people were asked to catch ball A or ball B in this particular formation, they used exactly the same hand grip aperture. And that's pretty interesting because it shows us that when you're asked to interact with an object, you only use that dorsal stream. When you're asked to perceive an object, you use that ventral stream. Right? And that's really interesting because it shows us that perception and action are inextricably linked. Right? So the object perception is deceived by the illusion, but the object-directed action is not perceived by it. Okay? So the nature of the visual information that we use depends really on what we intend to do with it, whether or not or how it invites action. Right. That's all about visual information or visual perceptual information. We can also talk in the same way about haptic or touch information or acoustic information. All of these sources of information can also present invariants within the environment. They can also be affordances for action. For example, you've seen tennis players do this, right? Before they're going to play, they're turning around the tennis racket, right? They're turning it in their hand. There's a few studies who've tried to look at why do people demonstrate that behavior, right? What's the usefulness of turning the racket around in your hand? And what they said is people turn the racket around, perceive to move, move to perceive, and move the racket so its invariants for action are revealed. It's like a small reminder of how heavy the racket is, how it feels in your hand, what its balance point is, etc. And that eventually then helps you to perform an action subsequently. And there's been some studies on people wielding rods, yeah? And they saw that the perception of the spatial characteristics of a rod are not affected by the density or the direction that you wield the rod or the rate in which you wield it. And you can replace rod here by tennis racket, which means that the perception of the haptic information of that rod was really about how it felt in the hand. We manipulate that tennis racket because it reveals invariant information for us that we then use for subsequent action. We're just reminding our body how heavy the racket feels or how it balances in the hand, etc. And the same thing happens for acoustic information. We all know acoustic information is important for the performance of motor skills, right? But lots of studies have investigated how acoustic information can provide an affordance for action, how it can invite action. And I forgot to put the references in here, but there's some studies indicating that the different sounds of bat to ball contact in table tennis provide an affordance for action. the pacing sounds made by a pacer that swimmers wear provide an affordance for action. And here's some studies where I did include the references, is that, and that's an interesting one, when I used to, we were forced to participate in experiments in motor control, hence my passion for the topic. So we were forced to participate in experiments with motor control, and those experiments were one-handed ball catching. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of balls you have to catch with one hand. What this study showed is they replicated the results from this particular study here, is that when you're standing in a room, you don't actually need that much perceptual information of a ball. Because when you're standing there for long enough, you get attuned to the sound of the ball machine, the acoustic sound of the ball machine, and it can reveal something about the trajectory of a ball. And that might seem weird to you now, but you could replicate this experiment, have the acoustic sound of a ball machine, and after a while, you'd be amazingly good at catching a ball with very little information available. So haptic information really provides an affordance for action. Same when the acoustic information was removed when people were playing table tennis. When you remove that acoustic information, all of a sudden these people become less expertful, because they are experts, because they are attuned to the affordances in the environment provided by the acoustic information. Yeah. So in summary, what did we do today is we looked at how perceptual information from the visual array around us can be used for action. Yeah? So we looked at informational constraints of action. We talked about perception-action coupling as a cyclical relationship that sort of supersedes the need for a lot of cognitive processing. We called that the ecological approach or the ecological perspective, and then we said that in order to interact with such an information-rich environment, we reveal invariants for action, and those invariants for action are important to us because they invite us to perform particular motor skills. All right? Hopefully that is all clear. If not, please come and ask me a question. This is the last bit that you need to know for your exam next week. If you have any questions along the way or you want to ask me stuff, I'm available on email until then. All right. Thank you.